Lighting sucks today.
Yes. Not.
I am back with the kind of after of taking apart my first experiment with unraveling yarn. Here is the finished yarn, and I wound it into two hanks. They're about half and half. In total, these skeins are 800, a total of 800 yards, about 400 grams total. So that makes it about a worsted weight if it's consistent with the weight to yardage ratio of most synthetic yarns like acrylic. So as a reminder, this was part of a hand knit short sleeve tunic like sweater that I found at a thrift store, and I pulled it apart. It was pieced, and right after I had unraveled it, I did a quick burn test to determine how I should wash it. And the burn test, so I'm not going to go over each outcome of the burn test and how it determines what fiber you are working with, but during the burn test, I took a little strand of the yarn, just flicked on a lighter, stuck it in. It had a sustained burn, and the burned parts would quickly bead up, melt, and form a darkish brown-black bead, which is consistent with the behavior of most acrylic yarns in a burn test. I did also compare it to a yarn that I knew was acrylic, so I took this is probably like Care and Simply Soft or something that I had on hand. It behaved really similarly, so I'm pretty confident that this yarn is acrylic, which means that since I paid about $3 for the original garment, I didn't save all that much, but it was still a good experience. And I kind of lucked out with my first unraveling experience being acrylic, because that meant there was no chance of it felting or really falling apart during the unraveling. So I think it was a good beginner experience. A quick note on washing the yarn. After I did the burn test, found out it was synthetic. All right, didn't have to worry about felting it during washing. So when I washed it, I used the hottest water I could get from my bathtub, and I put in some dish soap. I knew I didn't have to be gentle with this, and if anything, a little bit of roughness during washing would just help soften it up a little more. So yep, that's what I did. Then I rinsed it, and with not as hot water, but still pretty warm water, like water at a temperature I'd take a bath in. And then I wrung out the water, again, not worried about felting, and just hung it to dry. I didn't weight it any. I found that it wasn't really necessary to work out the kinks. I see that some people who unravel sweaters for yarn will put weights on the skeins while they're hanging them to dry. I didn't find that necessary, because as the water drips out of the skein, it would just provide weight anyways. And by the way, I skeined it using my nitty knotty, because that's the best way I know how to skein it. So yeah. So some highlights of the unraveling, because as I was unraveling, I was also kind of reverse engineering the garment, since I knew it was hand knit and I wanted to see what techniques this specific knitter was using. It was a pieced garment, so the knitter first knit the front and back pieces and then did some seaming to pick up ribbing for, say, the sleeve cuffs and the collar. And one feature that stood out, even when I was looking at the original garment, was that the shoulder seams had a really unique look. They looked really ridged. I'm gonna insert an image here. They had these ridges along the seam that stood out really nicely against the garment, and also kind of reduced the bulk of the seam, because when you do the usual horizontal mattress stitch or even vertical mattress stitch, you do get a bit of bulk in the finished seam, which makes it really strong, but also maybe for a warmer weather garment like this was, it might not have been so desirable. So the knitter they just picked up one leg from each of the bind off edges of the pieces being seamed, which left one leg on each side to form that nice ridge. So that's a little twist on the seaming technique that I think I will keep in the back of my mind. It was, it was a nice finish. One other thing, so everything interesting to me went on in the shoulder and collar region. So as I was unraveling, the reverse engineering did help my unraveling process, I feel, because I tried to figure out the order that the seams took place in so that I could reverse that order of operations. And basically, I would more easily unravel each piece as they were done, and I wouldn't have to run into, I started unraveling this piece, but there was a piece that was knit after it, so now this yarn's getting all looped around, stuff like that. Where I was kind of surprised by the order of the seaming was in the shoulders. So it looked like, I thought, and maybe as a contemporary knitter, I'm very used to picking up my stitches in the round, actually like this sweater, for a collar, picking up all your stitches and knitting the collar in the round and finishing it that way. But this pattern had the knitter, or maybe the knitter chose to do this, they picked up all the stitches on the for the collar and knit the collar flat back and forth, and then seamed up that side. That seam actually lined up with one of the shoulder seams. So I'm guessing that the order during finishing was the knitter actually did one shoulder seam, picked up the ribbing for one sleeve, and did picked up for the collar, knit the collar, and then seamed this shoulder seam, and then picked up the ribbing for the other sleeve, which is interesting. So I wouldn't have guessed that from looking at it until I started picking it apart. I'm like, wait, this collar wasn't knit in the round, it was knit flat. One more thing, while I was doing this process, I was taking notes in a Google Doc, and I figured that would be my best way to also share it with people. So I will be including the link to my notes in the video description, and that will be publicly available. I will also be putting it on my Patreon page, but for visible to everyone. Patreon has just been a nice way for me to collect links to my documentation of my work, since I don't really keep a real blog. So sometimes Patreon's a little bit of like a pseudo blog and kind of just directory of my work for me. So yeah, that's where you can find my stuff. So I thought that was interesting, and I had a lot of fun doing it. I can't wait to do it to more garments, and I have some commercially knit garments lined up, so I think it was also nice to ease myself into this process with a hand knit garment where I know more about the finishing techniques and I can more easily reverse engineer it. So we'll see how that applies to a commercially knit garment. All right,